Spinoza's God has none of the requisite psychological and moral characteristics required for the exercise of providence. Above all, Spinoza's God is numerically identical with nature. God is nature. Therefore, God has no will, intentions, or plans. God is not wise, just, good, or providential in any sense whatsoever. There is no supernatural. The only thing that is nature. And God is identical with this nature. And whatever happens in the universe happens necessarily simply as a result of the laws and processes of nature. Spinoza, in other words, completely rejects the personal anthropomorphic conception of God that grounds traditional sectarian religions, which Spinoza regards simply as organized superstitions. Now, one of the very popular readings of Spinoza, one that you'd find both in the 17th and 18th centuries and also in the most recent edition of the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy, Spinoza is often called a pantheist, a way of preserving a kind of religiosity in Spinoza. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. Well, I mean, there are things that would be further from the truth, but this is pretty far from the truth. Spinoza was not a Catholic. That would be further from the truth as well. There are two varieties of pantheism. Here's one variety of pantheism. All pantheisms share the basic claim that God is nature, or God is in nature. And one way of understanding that is to think of God as a supernatural element within nature, kind of like water in a sponge. That certainly cannot be Spinoza's view, because God is not simply in nature as a supernatural element residing within the world of nature, because Spinoza has no conception of the supernatural. All there is nature. Whatever is purely natural. Another variety of pantheism, however, would agree with that ontological claim. There's nothing but nature. There's no supernatural element beyond nature. There's no supernatural element within nature. However, the pantheist would still say God is nature. And you might ask, well, what's the difference between that and atheism? My claim would be that Spinoza is truly an atheist in the following sense. If there's any difference between a pantheist and an atheist, it's not going to be in the ontology if they both agree that all there is nature. So the differences are going to have to lie in the proper psychological attitude to take towards nature. And as far as I can tell, what the pantheists must mean when they claim that God is nature, or God is in nature, is that nature is therefore deserving of worshipful awe, a kind of religious attitude, perhaps even fear or dread. And nature might be the object of a religious experience. And there's no room whatsoever in Spinoza's philosophy for worshipful awe or any type of reverential attitude towards nature. The proper attitude to take towards nature is scientific understanding, a deep investigation of its secrets, the laws that operate, and why things come about with the necessity that they do. To stand in front of nature with an attitude of worshipful awe, for Spinoza, he likens that to gaping at it like a fool. And that's simply the path to the irrational passions of hope and fear. The minute you stand in front of nature with worshipful awe, you start to become you're overcome by perhaps fear of what might happen or hope for what might come. And these, for Spinoza, are harmful passions. And the way to diminish the force of these passions in our lives and achieve some modicum of well-being and tranquility and peace of mind is through intellectual understanding, not through the passions. So Spinoza is not a pantheist. He is an atheist. There's no room whatsoever for any type of religious attitude in the face of God or nature. There is no intrinsic morality in nature. God is not good or evil. Nature is not good or evil. Nature just is. Whatever happens simply happens as a result of the laws and could not have been otherwise. The definition of good, according to Spinoza, is simply what best serves an individual's true interests. What is good for me is what is in my best interest. That is what maximizes my power of surviving and navigating the obstacles of nature, somehow avoiding the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. What is bad is what is detrimental to my nature, what will harm me, what will stand in my way of thriving as a rational being. This doesn't mean that Spinoza is some rampant egoist who thinks that I have no moral duties to others, because it is in fact in my own best interest to ensure that other people act in certain ways. I think Socrates in the Apology put this quite well. When Socrates is defending himself against the claim that he's corrupted his fellow citizens of Athens, Socrates' defense is basically, what do you think I am, an idiot? I have to live with these people. Why would I act in such a way that corrupts them when I would have to continue to live among corrupted individuals? Therefore, your claim is patently absurd. Well, Spinoza is, I think, inspired by this claim of Socrates. And while his moral philosophy is thoroughly egoistic in the sense that all motivation for acting ethically is self-interest, he hopes to have demonstrated that it is in your own self-interest to see other people become as virtuous and thrive as rational beings as you do. So Spinoza, then, is an atheist for whom ethical behavior has nothing whatsoever to do with the truth of religious beliefs. Religious stories, and especially the stories of the Bible, can reinforce ethical behavior. And Spinoza is not beyond conceding that the people who wrote the Bible were outstanding moral teachers. But this doesn't mean that they were scientists, philosophers, metaphysicians, historians, or had any access to what is true. What they saw was that certain type of stories can inspire us to moral behavior. But morality itself, the foundations of morality, are independent of theology. Well, this brings us to, I think, maybe was what is often the thought behind the view that there can be no morality with God. Why then be moral if there's no eternal reward or punishment? If it's not a hope for reward in heaven or fear of punishment in hell, what is the possible motivation for doing the right thing, for being a moral person? Now, I want to distinguish that from another question which philosophers are always concerned about, and that would be the question of weakness of will, or crasia, or incontinence. The problem of incontinence or weakness of the will is not why should I be moral, but why is it the case that sometimes knowing what the moral thing to do is and being motivated to do the moral thing, I fail to do it? I know that I should do A, and I want to do A, and somehow, in the end, I fail to do A. That's the problem of weakness of the will. The motivation problem is, I know what is the right thing to do is, I see exactly what morality demands, and yet I can still ask, why should I do it? I feel no motivation to do what is right. And this is the problem that philosophers have struggled with, particularly once you've eliminated a theological superstructure for morality. Kant wrestled with it. Utilitarian philosophers like Mill wrestled with it. Spinoza, I think, once you've grounded ethics in self-interest, without giving up on moral duties to others, you can short-circuit the motivation problem because the motivation is built into the nature of morality itself. Once you see that human beings are naturally motivated by self-interest, in Spinoza's view, you can then move on to the weakness of will problem. Not ask why should we be motivated to do good, but then ask why do people ever fail to do what is right. What then do we have to learn today from Spinoza? Let me just suggest two things. First of all, there was lots of talk yesterday about how we can never prove that there is no personal transcendent God. In fact, Spinoza, as far as I can tell, is one philosopher at least who did think you could demonstrate with absolute certainty that there is no personal transcendent God. By demonstrating what nature is, an eternal infinite substance actively generating everything that happens, and then taking the traditional definition of God, an eternal infinite substance who generates everything that happens, and show that one necessarily implies the other, you can demonstrate in the fact that if you truly understand what God is and truly understand what nature is, you can demonstrate that there is no such thing as a personal transcendent God, the God of sectarian religions. Secondly, Spinoza also shows us that there's a path. By giving up on religion, you don't necessarily have to give up on questions about the meaning of life. In fact, you have a much clearer path to answering them. Spinoza, I think, introduces, and here, this is not something that Spinoza dealt with directly, but I think in Spinoza, we have a very nice analytical distinction between questions about the meaning of life and questions about the origins of life and the purpose of life. For Spinoza, you don't need to answer questions about the origin of life or the purpose of life to answer questions about the meaning of life. There's a problem with Spinoza in that he absolutely rejects free will. So what you cannot find in Spinoza is a kind of existentialist conception of the meaning of life. It's whatever you in your absolute freedom decide to make of it. But nonetheless, I think a great deal is gained by distinguishing questions about the meaning of life from questions about where life came from, why are we, what brought us here, and where are we going. Bayle, one of those 17th century impresarios, I think summed up the value of Spinoza quite nicely when he said, Bayle absolutely abhorred Spinoza's philosophy. He called it a dangerous atheism, and yet he said that Spinoza's life shows us that one could be a perfectly virtuous person without believing in God.